Now I want to introduce someone with whom I have long worked. We were 4 when we met 35 years ago. And with whom I've worked since the 1980s on issues related to agricultural and pesticide safety, when she was the lead scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I was a young community organizer working with pesticide poison victims and organic farmers. Lawrie Mott specializes in environmental health and science and has recently focused on Western water issues. Lawrie launched a new project to safeguard children from environmental health threats, including lead, air pollution, and pesticides. Working on climate change, sustainable agriculture, educational equity, children's environmental health, and independent media for social change, Lawrie has served on many government advisory committees and nonprofit boards, including Envision Education, Cool the Earth, Resource Media, and the US EPA's Children Health Protection Advisory Committee. Lawrie posthumously edited and completed A Dangerous Place, California's Unsettling Fate, by Mark Reisner, her late husband and author of Cadillac Desert. She's now completing a final chapter to update Cadillac Desert for a new edition coming later this year. Lawrie has not spoken on the subject of water before. We are her first conference that's going to be hearing about her update to her husband's book, Cadillac Desert, a new look at the Cadillac Desert. Lawrie Mott.
Good morning. It is amazing that Izzy and I have known each other for 35 years. I can't quite believe that. But I have to say that in those 35 years, Izzy has always been ambitious, and thankfully, she's always audacious, as you heard today. Anyway, I'm going to talk about water. This is a new topic for me. I was really working on environmental health issues for a long time and sort of got sidetracked into water. I think it probably happens to just about everybody when you live in California, whether it's the weather or where you live or the river or the bay or the ocean, it's there. It's a pretty common topic. So my question that I would like to dive into today, no pun intended, is can California's 20th century water infrastructure function in the 21st century reality of climate change? In the 25 years since Mark wrote The Afterword to Cadillac Desert, climate change and severe drought have made water in California even more precious. 2016 was the hottest year on record for the planet, with 16 of the 17 hottest years occurring in just this century. In California, we've endured 5 years of deep drought. The new reality of climate change fundamentally challenges the systems of dams, reservoirs, aqueducts, canals, and levees built in the 20th century, when we really believed we could re-engineer nature and move water from where it was to where it wasn't. We ought to know better by now. Dams do have benefits. The American Desert West is livable for large numbers of us because of them, but they're perilous too. The near catastrophe at Oroville Dam, if we need a reminder, highlighted our past hubris and should serve as a lesson for our future. Less visibly dramatic, but equally alarming, are decades of siphoning water away from the environment to farms and cities. It's ruined fisheries as well as river and delta ecosystems. As Izzy mentioned, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is in crisis. Wild salmon and other fish are on their brink of existence. As we all know, in the first 2 months of this year, a phalanx of super wet storms walloped California. These pineapple expresses saved the state from entering its 6th consecutive year of drought. This is good news, but full reservoirs and a healthy snowpack do not end the state's continual water woes. Nor does one spectacular winter erase a 5-year drought or reverse the long-term decline in groundwater, a critical supply for our state. Debilitating droughts are guaranteed in California. Some will be short, as in 1976 to 77, some lengthy, as in 1987 to 92, and of course, this most recent one. Meanwhile, the thirsty population of California has doubled in just 4 decades, from 22 million to nearly 40 million people. And the even more thirsty agriculture industry has doubled its acreage planted in almonds and pistachio orchards and vineyards, crops that require water permanently and cannot be fallowed during droughts. Climate change does not cause droughts, but it has certainly made their repercussions worse. Our water storage and distribution systems depend on a large snowpack remaining high in the Sierra into the mid to late summers. In what were considered normal years, the snowpack provided 30% of California's water. With warmer temperatures, snow melts faster and earlier in the mountains, more precipitation comes as rain, and water evaporates more quickly from plants, soil, rivers, and reservoirs. Climate change will also cause precipitation to occur in extreme events, extreme droughts followed by extreme storms, basically what happened this winter. And rather than recharging underground water supplies, precipitation could be lost as runoff, or worse, as floods. The record-breaking snow this winter pushed at least 2 dams in California beyond their limits. You are all well aware of the impressive water releases at Oroville Dam, just 75 miles north of here. You've seen the photos, you've seen the videos, you know the spillway has been torn and ripped into 2. Maybe you even witnessed it firsthand. 31 years ago, almost to the day, Mark, my late husband, sped up to Oroville because he was into disaster porn, as we called it. He stood at the base of the spillway safely across the Feather River, I'm glad to say, and he was awed by the volume of water coming down the spillway. And in his words, and this is in the afterword, he had a mordant wish to watch a dam collapse. It didn't happen then, but this winter was a close call. So, as standard operating procedure to control the lake levels, the dam operators send huge amounts of water down that spillway, about 100,000 cubic feet per second down the spillway over several days. Think about that. That's more than the volume of Niagara Falls. The surge severed the spillway in 2, and it put a huge volume of mud and rock into the Feather River. Initially, the state thought the biggest threat was to the state fish hatchery just 4 miles downstream. That fish hatchery raises half of the salmon caught off the coast of California. So initially, the state focused on and successfully evacuated, think about it, 5 million juvenile salmon to a new hatchery in just 48 hours. That was where the state was focused initially. You know what happened next. The state then realized that perhaps the emergency spillway would fail, and the Butte County Sheriff, fearing the collapse of that spillway and a wall of water inundating Oroville, Marysville, and Yuba City downstream, ordered the evacuation of 188,000 people. That's a lot of people, a lot of traffic jams. Let's go back to Oroville and think about it. At 770 feet, it's the tallest dam in this country. That's something that I didn't even know until this crisis. And it's pretty amazing to think that that dam is the biggest one in this country, bigger than Hoover, taller than Shasta. It's also the state's second largest reservoir, when it is the linchpin of the state water project. In California, we have a state water project and a federal water project. The state water project delivers water to 25 million Californians and thousands of acres of agriculture, largely in the Central Valley. The dam, as Izzy mentioned, is only 49 years old. That's relatively young. Compare that to Shasta Dam, the largest reservoir in the federal project. That's 72 years old. Or compare it to O'Shaughnessy Dam, which is the dam that supplies San Francisco's water supply. That's 92 years old. So this is a young dam, a relatively young dam, built to newer engineering standards that, although the state will be very quick to say the dam didn't fail, I would say the dam system was on the verge of failing, because if the emergency spillway failed, the dam would have failed. The dam would have stood technically, but the system for holding the water upstream would have failed. The Department of Water Resources just recently awarded a $275 million contract to repair the Oroville spillway, but it's still unclear who pays the bill. And as we know, when the bill is large, everybody always fights about who pays and how much. Normally, those who get the water from the State Water Project would pay for the bill. That means the Metropolitan Water District in Southern California, Santa Clara Valley Water District, that's the San Jose area, and agricultural users in the Central Valley. They would all foot the bill. You know, none of them anticipated this expense, so they're going to be looking for ways not to pay. And the federal government declared the Oroville dam failure near catastrophe federal disaster. So there will be some FEMA money available as well. So there's going to be, no doubt, there will be lots of arguing about who pays and how much. The second dam emergency, which was minor compared to Oroville, but potentially equally devastating, occurred at Anderson Dam, which is uphill from San Jose. The heavy rain filled the reservoir and water thundered over its spillway, flooding parts of San Jose along Coyote Creek. 10,000 residents were evacuated. Their homes were flooded. And consider something else about this dam. It sits next to the Calaveras Fault, which, according to the USGS, has a 26% chance of incurring a large earthquake by 2043. Now, only the USGS could come up with those kind of 26% by 2043, but the point remains, the dam, like many others in the state, is very near an active earthquake fault, and there is a large likely probability that there will be some seismic activity there. And interestingly, because of the seismic challenges, risks there, the dam is only ever allowed to, it has to top out at 68% of capacity. It cannot go any higher than 68% of its storage capacity because of this potential seismic risk and its failure. In the 20th century, dams civilized the American West. Hoover, Shasta, Grand Coulee, and Bonneville, all built in the 1930s, were edifices of enormous proportions, engineering masterpieces, and symbolic achievements. This is during the Depression. It was proof that the US government could do something. We could achieve something grand. Building things made us feel better. Hundreds more went up in the 1950s and the 1960s, none quite as ambitious as the earlier ones. All these dams brought irrigation, they brought electricity, and eventually millions and millions of people. And they wreaked havoc on the environment. Salmon runs lost, particularly salmon runs lost. On this front, in the 21st century, some news is perhaps surprisingly good with dams, but very bad in another aspect. The century-old passion for building huge dams with colossal government subsidies to entice farmers and ranchers to settle the arid West and make the desert bloom and cattle multiply is finally over. Huge construction projects subsidized by federal and state governments are financial relics of our profligate past. Besides, the best sites, the ones with narrow river canyons and good, stable geology in unpopulated areas, are already taken. This is good news. On the other hand, the ongoing impact of existing dams on the future of wild salmon is dire. It's really, really, really damaging. Now, I'll try and be a little bit fair about it. Dams and reservoirs do permit unimaginable numbers of people to inhabit forbiddingly arid regions and floodplains, for that matter. But the systems built to move floodwaters rapidly to the ocean are now obscenely out of sync with this era when every drop of fresh water is precious. And furthermore, the extreme high tides and large winter storms caused by climate change will further test the limits of this 20th century infrastructure. As Izzy mentioned, sooner or later, every reservoir silts up, and it necessarily follows that the storage capacity is correspondingly diminished. In California, scientists estimate that sedimentation has now decreased the state's reservoir capacity by 4.5%. Now, that may not sound so much, but that's about as much as 1.7 million acre-feet, which is about as much as some of the new reservoirs that are being proposed would hold. I'm getting the time sign, so I'm going to try and not speed up, condense, shall we say. So trapping the sediment also not only cuts off the storage capacity, but there's one very important thing it does. It prevents the natural flow of sediment to rebuild beaches and wetlands, which are our critical defense against sea level rise. So we're damaging the salmon, but we're also, talk about two problems at once that could be solved. We are reducing our capacity to enhance our frontline defense from sea level rise. In California, one good piece of news, the San Clemente Dam on Carmel River was finally taken down in 2015. This dam had been out of commission since 2002. It was already 95% filled with sediment, and it had been called a seismic risk since 1992. So that's one good sign. As Izzy talked about cleaning up sediment to find gold, to get clean gravel, sand that could be used for fish restoration projects. That's all very important. Thank you, Sierra Fund, for doing that work, and keep going. 5 years of drought have taken a really heavy toll on the state. Groundwater depletion, 1 million dead trees, largely in the Sierra, creating catastrophic fire risk, and the decline of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River, Delta, excuse me. With this arcane system of senior and junior water rights, surface water is somewhat managed. It's not wholly a free-for-all. With groundwater, unrestrained use has been the rule. Cut off farmers' surface water, and they just tap into the ground below them to get the water they need. Wells are expensive. Alfalfa growers, an annual crop, might not dig a deeper well. They might just let their crop go fallow for a year. The growers that have put in almonds and pistachios and grapes, they have to dig a deeper well. Those are perennial crops, and they can't survive without a year of water. So groundwater is being sucked up at alarming rates. The Department of Resources has said that the highest priority areas for overuse and subsidence are largely in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, areas where agriculture reigns. Hopefully somebody will ask a question about that. When shallow wells run dry, particularly in small communities that cannot afford to dig deeper wells, those are the first communities that have lost their water. East Porterville, just south of Fresno, basically wells started failing in 2014. The DWR completed a new well for them in 2015. So finally, by the end of this calendar year, supposedly all those homes will be connected to water support source. For 3 years, they've had no water source. They've had to depend on bottled water for drinking water for 3 years. Think about that. Overdrafting of groundwater also causes land to sink. In the Central Valley, land has subsided between a foot and 3 to 4 feet in the recent years. Sinking land is not just an idle concern, it also causes bridges and roads to fail. And now it's coming home to farmers. They overpumped the groundwater. That depletion is now causing the very aqueducts and canals that carry the water to them to sink. And the state, one of the key canals for the state is now down 2 feet in one part, which means not that it will not deliver water, but it must reduce its deliveries by 20%. Likewise, the federal canal, the Delta-Mendota Canal, is a major artery for the federal project, fell 2 feet in another area. So even the state now is considering restricting pumping in these areas because those two canals are vital to the delivery of all the state and federal water south of that part of the Central Valley. And then there's the Delta. Even if we had enough water in the state for everybody, we still have the problem that most of the water is in the north and most of the demand is in the south. But the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is also the largest estuary on the Pacific coast from Patagonia to Alaska. It covers more than 1,000 square miles, the size of Rhode Island, and it is the home of many species of wildlife and fish, some of which are endangered or threatened. To send water south, the state relies on huge huge pumps at the south end. It might as well be. They're bad. They're bad. Huge pumps at Tracy to send water into its huge canals that send water south. The problem is those pumps draw water unnaturally southward across the delta, which means that the pumps suck fish into including migratory salmon, and the delta smelt. And also, when the water is drawn southward, it causes salt water from San Francisco Bay to seep inward to the delta. And if that salty water gets to the pumps, it ruins the water supply for all of the farmers and all of the urban areas south of the delta. So clearly, too much is being asked of the delta. Right now, the challenge is, and this is part of state law, the new goal is to both protect the delta ecosystem and assure a reliable water supply for the state of California. Those are lofty goals. They're what the state calls as co-equal goals. The way right now the governor says he wants to do this is a huge twin tunnel project that would build 2 tunnels 150 feet under the delta. Talk about the sediment that Izzy mentioned. These are 2 tunnels, each 40 feet wide, send the water 35 miles to the south of the delta. Suffice it to say, it's challenging from a construction standpoint, it's challenging from an environmental standpoint, it's challenging from a financial standpoint, and I don't think it's going to happen. Okay, I'm going to get to my final piece, which is what do I see as the road ahead? I'll offer a couple of different suggestions. First, no new dams, no sites, no temperance flat, no tunnels. Instead, as we saw this winter, we have to inspect dams and their spillways far more frequently and far more thoroughly. We need to retrofit and upgrade those with structural and seismic weaknesses. We already know this includes Oroville, Anderson, and San Luis Dam. San Luis Dam is a dam south of the delta that is a storage facility for both the federal and state water projects. We should be focusing, I mean, if we want to deal with the water we've got to be taking care of the dams that create that. And it's going to be expensive too. So, but the problem is building new things is always much more exciting to certain people than maintaining older things. Second, we need to take down some dams. And up first, I would say the 4 dams on the Klamath River. There's been decades of agreement to take those 4 dams down. There were a couple of people in Congress who stood in the way, and luckily some very smart people, including my congressional representative, Jared Huffman, figured out a way to go through a federal decommissioning process that doesn't require congressional approval. But hopefully those dams will come down. Hopefully the new administration will not stop this. Next, we need to make conservation a way of life. I'm not going to talk about urban conservation because we know we can do that, but agriculture really has to conserve water. NRDC, my former employer, and the Pacific Institute estimated that agriculture could reduce its use of water by 20%. That's great. That estimate assumed no acreage is fallowed. I'm going to go further, and I'm going to say let's fallow some acreage. Let's replant solar farms. Let's replant them as solar farms. In particular, it's a good idea to fallow acreage where the soil is of bad quality and there's salts built up in it and you can't grow things. Particularly, this is worth considering in Westlands, the largest irrigation district in the world. There's naturally occurring selenium in that soil that produces toxic agricultural runoff. Fourth, we need to achieve sustainable groundwater management. There was a law passed in 2014 to do this, but it doesn't require the groundwater basins, the most critical ones, to be managed sustainably until 2040. That's way too far away. I think we need to take a more aggressive approach. I think we should prohibit new wells and overdrafted groundwater basins. It's just insane that we are allowing new wells to go in those overdrafted basins. I also think we should bar the planting of permanent crops in overdrafted basins. And finally, I would just suggest that on the groundwater, if we had immediate and public available publicly available data on how much groundwater was being used, I think we'd get sustainably managed groundwater sooner. Two more things. We need to learn to capture stormwater. Many of you likely saw the YOLO bypass this year, beautifully full for the first time in a long while. That Sacramento River overflow recharged groundwater. Also, talk about solving two problems at once, it provided important habitat for juvenile salmon to fatten up, and that makes them much more likely to survive their trip to the ocean. Finally, we need to invest in water recycling. This means treating wastewater for reuse. It's what they do up on the space station. Think about it, there's no other supply of water up there. What the humans produce is their water supply. I know that can seem, this is a stretch, but it's already happening. They do it in Las Vegas. They recycle all the water in Las Vegas. They do it in parts of San Diego and Orange County. And soon, their highly treated wastewater from Turlock and Modesto will be irrigating nearby crops. So it's starting to come. We just need to invest in it more. The challenges are everywhere for California water, but the way forward is not. We know what needs to be done. Farmers and cities must use much less water by increasing conservation, and especially agriculture. Water recycling, stormwater capture, and sustainable groundwater management must become the new normal. Taking down some dams will restore fish habitat. The environment, especially salmon and the Delta, must get a greater share of water. We have the know-how and the technology. The only question is how to put them into practice on the necessary scale. The unprecedented drought in California and as well as the record precipitation and floods may be our last and best chance to dramatically alter our water future. Let's not waste this opportunity. Thank you.